Congratulations for making the national finals. My name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank that does research around K-12 education reform, and I encourage the other judges to introduce.
Hello, my name is Darcy Kern. I am a professor of history at Southern Connecticut State University, and I am an alumna of the program. It's a great program. I'm glad you guys are in it, and I'm happy to talk to you today. Your microphone.
My name is Tim Isaacs. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Teaching the Rule of Law at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. And I want to congratulate you too for being here in the national finals and give special congratulations to your sponsor. Welcome and good luck.
Maybe you could introduce yourselves and your teacher.
Hello, my name is Emery Hill.
My name is Jed McNeese.
I'm Margot Buchanan. We're all seniors at Raleigh Charter High School, and Ms. Klein.
Terrific. So this is Unit 1. We'll be addressing question 1, and I'll read all of the Unit 1 question and all of question 1. So Unit 1, what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system? Question 1, quote, the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution, end quote. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Timer? You may begin.
Leading up to the Revolutionary War, American colonists had no representation in Parliament. They were taxed, jailed, and made subject to laws without being given a voice. This was at the hands of the British king, who consistently disregarded the rule of law by arbitrarily changing ordinances, bending court judges to his will, and using vice admiralty courts as punishment for patriots. In both individual state constitutions and our national constitution, we see the manifestation of these abuses in the emphasis on rule of law, popular sovereignty, and the rights to revolution and free speech.
These principles became the backbone of our country, with common law and the right to jury trial in every state constitution, as well as the Declaration in the National Constitution. The founders also took the revolutionary principle of popular sovereignty and used it to form a system of elected representatives, laid out in Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution. In addition, Amendments 9 and 10 ensure all excess powers left to the states and the people.
The rights to revolution and free speech were also very important during the founding period. There were many instances in which the colonists exercised their right to revolt, including the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act riots. When these didn't work, the Declaration of Independence was written as a means to deliver these grievances directly to the king. We see the right to revolution's integral role in the Declaration, as well as its presence in many early state constitutions. And despite the fact that the right to free speech is not present in most of those, it is emphasized in the very first amendment of the National Constitution.
Today, revolutionary principles are still very present in the US. Although the voting rights of marginalized groups in our country have been debated for centuries, we as a nation are still fighting to accomplish popular sovereignty. Just this past March, the Florida government made major changes to the voting rights of felons by allowing the automatic restoration of the right to vote and hold office. The rule of law has also repeatedly surfaced in recent public discourse.
In the summer of 2020, many former President Trump's actions were seen as violation of the rule of law. His constant undermining of the judicial system through his public derisions of judges, in his statements that he could, quote, stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, opposing voters, and pled that he was in some way above the law. Also, although it is debated that the rioters of January 6th were within their right to revolt, it was clearly a demonstration of revolutionary principles in action today.
John Locke's explanation of individual consent, as described by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is, quote, the mechanism by which political societies are created and individuals join those societies. This definition is one of many, as political philosophers, historians, and citizens alike have struggled to pin down what consent really means. When drafting a constitution, a multitude of questions arise, such as who consents to be governed, how people should consent, and how often. For example, although the Founding Fathers answered these questions in the Constitution, they did so in a way that did not properly represent our country. Even though they tried to ensure consent was given by requiring a supermajority for ratifying amendments and the Constitution, they restricted the vote to property-owning white men and presumed the consent of those who could not vote.
Through this system, anyone who does not consent is silenced, as the Native Americans were when their land was taken and their culture disregarded. Additionally, in subjecting future generations to the constitutions that are created, writers must assume that the tacit consent of future citizens will be maintained, despite having little concept of what the future may hold. While this can sometimes be remedied with amendments, governments are faced with the same issues when writing a constitution. Despite these problems, implementing consent imperfectly is vastly superior to completely abandoning it, because it allows us to urge our government to uphold revolutionary principles that are still evident today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So my fellow judges and I will have some follow-up questions, and I'll begin. Benjamin Rush, whose quote is in the question, was friends with both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were revolutionary allies and later presidential rivals. How did Jefferson and Adams's views around revolution differ?
I think one way they definitely differed is that Adams was a Federalist and Jefferson was an anti-Federalist. So they really saw that the way that the government should use their power, they saw that differently. So Adams viewed the government as needing to have more power in order to sort of control the people, whereas Jefferson saw that the government should be a means for the people to rule themselves, so leaving more power for the people.
You mentioned that you've mentioned several times that the rule of law. One of you said the rule of law has recently resurfaced. How so? What exactly did you mean by that?
So one way to resurface recently is an arbitrary enforcement of laws. There's been many issues, especially recently, about how laws are being enforced, if they're being enforced equally and fairly. And that is a huge component of rule of law. So when these issues do crop up, there's a lot of debate surrounding it regarding rule of law.
Another way is in the recent new Georgia voting laws and also voting laws that are coming up in many other states. So one of these is a new requirement for voter IDs. And this is a law that has been proven statistically to disproportionately affect Black voters. And this violates the rule of law because it violates the equal enforcement component of rule of law.
Also, in the protests we saw last summer, there was a very clear difference in enforcement of laws between the Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-mask protests. With the Black Lives Matter protests, we often saw the police using tear gas and rubber bullets, whereas we didn't see that with the anti-mask protests, despite the fact that neither one was particularly violent before the police arrived. And so I think with people noticing these differences, they started to do more research into it, maybe discovering the rule of law and creating that public discourse, specifically on social media.
Thank you.
My question kind of builds on that. You mentioned in your speech that imperfect consent is better than none. You talked about how Native Americans were not giving their consent to being removed from their land. How do we protect the rights of the minority from those of the majority, or from people who are not consenting to something from those who are consenting to it? How do we balance this idea of consent in public?
I think the only way really to do this is to expand voting rights as much as possible for minorities. There was a voting law in Arizona that kept ballot boxes, like mail-in boxes, about an hour outside of any Native American reservations. And so this obviously inhibits the ability for Native Americans to vote. And this is present day. And so any minority or person who is a minority that's not being able to vote, we need to kind of try to expand through new voting laws, expand the vote to as many people as possible so that they can be a part of consenting to the government. Because I believe that at least being given the ability to try to change your government, even if you're voting against something that the government is doing, is giving your consent.
I think another way, sorry, that we can protect the rights of people who are like vote against something or choose not to consent is to increase people's abilities to remove their consent from the government. John Locke's definition of tacit consent, or John Locke described tacit consent as if you are in a country, you are tacitly consenting to the government just by being there. So I think one way that we can improve this is by improving immigration policies, both in the US and in countries outside of the US, because really the only way to remove your tacit consent is to leave and move to another country. So by increasing that, we are giving people the ability to remove their consent from the government.
Great. So during the War for Independence, Washington and his aide Hamilton saw some grave weaknesses in the authority of the Continental Congress. What were some of those weaknesses, and did the Articles of Confederation remedy them?
One of the weaknesses of the Continental Congress was that it was very, very difficult to pass anything because I don't know the exact numbers, but the percentage of people needing to vote yes was very high. So they were having a really hard time getting anything done. And the Articles of Confederation remedy this a little bit, but really we don't see an improvement in that until the Constitution.
Yeah, I think it's clear when you consider the history from that time during the Articles of Confederation. The government had very little power. I mean, you couldn't really raise an army, couldn't really effectively levy taxes. There's not much they could do at all. So I would not say it was an effective solution for those issues.
Another problem with the Continental Congress was that there wasn't really a leader, like an executive branch that we have now. So there was sort of a struggle for power between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or between the different states. So the Articles of Confederation, again, didn't remedy this immediately, but we do see in the Constitution the creation of the executive branch and the judicial branch helped to spread out the power.
Could I circle back one more time with my question? I really like how you mentioned Locke and tacit consent, but what about, to Rush's quote, what about revolution? Do we still have a right to revolution if we do not give our consent to the government?
I think that we absolutely do. And we've even, as we mentioned in our paper, we've seen this right recently exercised. I think that we can see, if we look at the direct wording of the Declaration, it says that we should not revolt for light or transient causes, and that it should only be after constant abuses and usurpations of power by the government. And I think that the rioters of January 6th based their riot on these two kind of reasons. And so we can see that it was not for light and transient cause, if in their mind the person who was elected was not the person being installed into office. And yeah, I'll stop. Thank you.
All right, now congratulations to everybody. Well done. The judges will now give you some brief feedback.
First of all, I want to thank you and your teacher and your parents for all your hard work. It's difficult material. You folks, as a smaller group of 3, I thought did a really good job of working together and kind of complementing one another. I thought in your introductory remarks, you did a good job of hitting a lot of the historical touchstones about concerns about British kings and British common law. And I thought you were particularly strong in both your introductory remarks and in the Q&A on your knowledge of Locke and sort of the principles of consent. I thought you did a good job of sort of framing that up front, and then you carried that knowledge forward. I thought that Margot's response to my question on Jefferson and Adams, which I have to say is a tougher question, a more historically detailed question, was right on target. And so I want to thank you for that. And I think that the way in which you wove in discussions about consent with contemporary issues around voting laws or changes to voting laws and was, I thought, quite skillful. My colleague mentioned that your knowledge of and use of tacit consent. Again, that's how you use the lock and your knowledge of lock, and brought that forward during the Q&A. To my question about the Articles of Confederation, you were really quite strong in terms of outlining some of the weaknesses, the inability to raise taxes and to know executive authority. And so I think you should be very pleased. You had a very solid performance this morning.
I agree. I thought you were very strong in your examples and also in your reference to philosophical principles. I liked how you mentioned tacit consent and John Locke, but I also liked how you, on my follow-up about revolution, how you went into detail about the Declaration of Independence. I thought both of those were excellent, and they were a nice balance to each other. So I really enjoyed this. I thought you guys were good. I also liked how you mentioned how you started with no representation in Parliament, and you mentioned the Vice Admiralty courts. That's something that most people don't talk about, and I thought that was really unique and very strong.
I would simply say that I think to all the questions we asked, you provided very good responses. You were thoughtful. You didn't just blurt out answers. You could clearly see the wheels turning and the thought process is going on. Your responses were measured. Your responses were not filled with fluff. You looked to philosophical background, you looked for evidence. So I thought that the responses were, very, very strong and very well placed. And thank you very much.